The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, a scent I'd grown familiar with over the years. But today, as I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Travis County Courthouse in Austin, Texas, the scent seemed foreign. It clung to me like a second skin, amplifying every nerve in my body. I wasn't here in my usual role, standing confidently at the prosecution table, file in hand, eyes fixed on the truth. Today I was seated at the opposite end of justice. I was the defendant. My heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as I walked to the defense table. Every step felt heavier than the last, though I kept my spine straight, my chin up. I refused to let them see me falter. The judge hadn't even entered the room yet, but the atmosphere was already thick with tension. My palms were damp, though I didn't let them tremble. I was used to pressure, but this was personal. When I glanced toward the plaintiff's table, I saw them. Carolyn and Jack. My parents. Or rather, the two people who had abandoned me before I could form a single memory of them. My heart gave a sharp, involuntary jolt. It had been decades, and yet the sight of them sliced through me like fresh glass. Carolyn was immaculate. Her pearl-white blazer was tailored to perfection, her makeup professionally done, her hair pulled back into a tight, elegant twist. A diamond bracelet, thick, ostentatious, glittered on her wrist each time she adjusted the collar of her blouse. Jack sat beside her, slightly slouched, trying to look less uncomfortable than he obviously was. His gray suit couldn't quite hide the nervous twitch in his jaw or the way his eyes scanned the courtroom, avoiding mine. Cowardice still clung to him like sweat. They didn't recognize me. That much was clear. Their gazes passed over me without a flicker of recognition. As if I were just another stranger caught in some family dispute. Maybe they expected someone fragile, someone broken down by a life of hardship after being thrown away. But I was not that girl. Not anymore. They had no idea that the woman sitting across from them had clawed her way through law school, fought tooth and nail for every trial, every conviction, every ounce of respect. They didn't know I was one of the most respected prosecutors in this county. And they certainly didn't expect me to stand between them and the fortune they suddenly claimed they had a right to. The irony almost made me smile. The courtroom was filling now. Legal clerks, court reporters, the bailiff by the door. The murmurs of casual conversations faded as the judge's assistant stepped forward and called the room to order. I stood automatically when the judge entered, a reflex ingrained from years of practice. Judge Mendez, a woman I'd appeared before countless times, gave me a brief glance that didn't linger. Good. I didn't want favoritism. I wanted facts. When I sat again, I adjusted my jacket and opened my legal pad, even though I knew the case file front to back. My attorney, Mark, leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded once. No words. He'd been with me since the beginning of this mess, when the summons first arrived, when the names on the paperwork ripped through my carefully buried past like an old wound reopened. Carolyn and Jack had filed a claim on the estate of my grandmother, Eleanor Blake, a woman who had raised me from infancy after they walked out. A woman who, despite her stern ways and hard hands, had given me everything they had not. Love, shelter, stability. Her passing had left a hollow ache in my chest I hadn't dared express aloud. And now, like scavengers circling a body, they had returned, not for reconciliation but for money. The case was absurd. They claimed Eleanor had manipulated the will. That she wasn't of sound mind when she left everything to me, her house, her land, the small savings she'd carefully tucked away over the years. They wanted to contest it, citing parental rights they'd long since forfeited. They said they were entitled to a portion, if not the entirety, of her estate as her direct descendants through me. They didn't even flinch as their attorney stood and made the opening statement, speaking of family bonds and unjust estrangements, as if they'd ever known what it meant to be parents. I sat there, my jaw clenched, forcing my breath into even rhythms. I refused to let them see the storm beneath my skin. As the hearing progressed, I watched Carolyn's performance. The poised victim. The grieving daughter-in-law. She wiped away tears that didn't smudge her mascara. She spoke of regret, of years lost, of a daughter she had never stopped loving. Lies came easily to her. Jack said less, mostly nodding when prompted, his discomfort more visible now. When it was my turn, I stood. Every movement was deliberate. I looked directly at them, let silence stretch for a beat longer than necessary. My voice was calm, clear, and laced with every truth they had tried to bury. "I was 10 months old when you left," I began. "You didn't write. You didn't call. You disappeared and left me with a woman you now accuse of manipulation. That woman raised me. She fed me. She worked double shifts at a diner to buy my school books. She taught me right from wrong, and she taught me how to fight for justice. She is the only parent I have ever known." Their attorney objected, but the judge allowed me to continue. "She didn't manipulate anyone. He didn't need to. When you left, you gave up every right to me. And now you stand here pretending to care when the only thing you want is the money she left behind. You didn't come back when I was in the hospital at 16. You didn't show up when I graduated law school. You didn't even send a condolence when she died. And yet here you are claiming grief. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was still. Carolyn's expression flickered just once and Jack dropped his eyes. They saw me now, not the baby they'd abandoned, not the young girl they thought would crumble under the weight of their return, but the woman I had become. A woman forged from absence, sharpened by rejection, strengthened by love that came not from blood, but from choice. And for the first time since this began, I felt the tide shift. The memories come back to me not like a wave but like a slow, steady fog that creeps in through the cracks of my present. One moment I'm sitting in a courtroom, 21st century daylight streaking through stained glass, and the next I'm 6 years old again, my knees scraped and my eyes searching the driveway for people who never came back. But it started long before 6. It started in 1996 when I was barely more than a baby, barely able to form full sentences, clutching a small stuffed dog with frayed ears and missing stitches. That morning had a strange stillness to it. I remember the color of the sky, a dull gray-blue like paper soaked in dishwater. I remember my mother's perfume, too strong, almost bitter, and the way she kissed me on the forehead but didn't meet my eyes. They told Harold and Beverly it would only be for a few months. Just until we get on our feet, my father said, his arm around Carolyn's shoulder like a stage prop. We're moving to Houston. New jobs, new place. We'll be back before Christmas. I wonder now if they believed their own words or if they were simply rehearsing lines they'd already memorized. Harold, always a man of principle, had looked them both in the eye and nodded once. Beverly was already pulling me into her lap, brushing crumbs off the chair as she set me down. I remember her voice, soft even when firm. Of course we'll take care of her. She's our granddaughter. No one said anything about it lasting years. No one warned me that this would be the beginning of everything, and the end of something I would never get to know. The house smelled like lemons and old books. Beverly kept it clean, obsessively so, but never sterile. There was warmth in every object. The faded crocheted blankets, the chipped teacups, the rows of photos on the mantelpiece, none of which featured Carolyn or Jack after 1996. I came to know those rooms like the back of my hand. The wooden banister that creaked on the third step. The bathroom tiles that cooled my feet during feverish nights. The smell of Harold's tobacco even after he stopped smoking it. It was my home, but also a museum of a family that had to rebuild itself after its own children disappeared. At first I waited for them. Every weekend I'd sit on the porch with Harold. He'd read the newspaper aloud to me, switching to funny voices when I grew restless. I'd watch the street with aching eyes, searching every car that passed. I drew them pictures. I taped them to the window. I had a list in my head, things to show them, things to tell them when they came back. But weeks passed and then months and the drawings yellowed in the sun. Beverly would wrap me in her arms during thunderstorms. "It's all right, baby," she'd whisper into my hair. "You're safe here." And I was. In every way they knew how they made me safe. Harold, despite his sternness, was a storyteller. He'd been a judge for almost 3 decades before retiring, and though he never talked much about the courtroom, he told me stories about justice. Real justice. The kind that didn't always follow rules but always followed truth. He taught me how to argue, how to listen, how to hold my ground without raising my voice. On Saturday mornings he'd quiz me on history, ethics, even logic puzzles. He'd pour me a glass of apple juice and say, "Convince me this isn't orange juice," and I'd giggle as I tried to prove my case. I didn't realize it then, but that was the beginning of everything I would become. Beverly was softer but no less powerful. She kept track of my every school assignment, every recital, every scraped knee. She was the one who stood at every parent-teacher meeting, her hand tight around mine, her voice proud. She knew when I was lying before I did. She never punished with anger, only disappointment, which somehow stung more. She showed me how to be strong without being cruel. She taught me that love wasn't a performance. It was the quiet, consistent presence of someone who showed up. Every day, no matter what. The holidays were hardest. Every Christmas, Beverly still wrapped a present from Mom and Dad. A book. A necklace. A letter she had written herself, pretending. I knew. Always knew. But I played along because pretending hurt less than the silence. One year I asked her why they didn't come. She paused before answering, her hands still in dishwater. "Sometimes people don't know how to love the way they should," she said. "And sometimes they don't want to learn." That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. By the time I was in middle school, the waiting had stopped. I no longer watched the road. I stopped telling people they were just away. When someone asked, I said they were gone. Not dead. Not divorced. Just gone. And the ache that once sat sharp and fresh inside me became something duller, something more like a shadow. Followed me, sure, but it didn't control me. Beverly and Harold were there for every science fair, every spelling bee, every school play where I forgot my lines. Harold stood in the rain during my first soccer game, his coat over my backpack to keep it dry. Beverly stayed up until midnight sewing my Halloween costume the night before school because I'd changed my mind at the last minute. They were always there. Without complaint. Without conditions. They weren't replacements. They were the only parents I ever really had. And yet part of me always wondered, just a sliver of a thought I'd never speak aloud, what I had done to make them leave. Had I cried too much? Had I been inconvenient? Was I too much of a burden for two people trying to live their lives? But every time that thought surfaced, it was crushed by Beverly's hands smoothing my hair, or Harold's voice calling me Scout, even when I was 17 and full of attitude. Whatever I lacked in origins I made up for in love. Still, their absence became a presence all its own. It shaped me. It sharpened the edges of who I was. It made me wary of promises and allergic to dependency. It made me work harder, speak louder, aim higher. Because deep down, some stubborn piece of me needed to prove I was worth staying for. Not just to them but to the world. Years later, when I stood on the graduation stage and looked out into the crowd, I saw Beverly waving with both hands and Harold trying not to cry. And I felt that whole again. Not because they weren't enough, but because I finally understood that absence doesn't go away just because you stop looking for it. It lives beside you. Quiet. Persistent. Waiting. But that day in court, when I looked into Carolyn's perfectly lined eyes and Jack's downturned face, I didn't feel empty. I felt anchored. I remembered who raised me. Who showed up. Who shaped me not with words but with action. And I realized that the people who brought me into this world had taken nothing from me except their own place in it. They left me on a doorstep and called it temporary. But I built a life on that doorstep. And I never looked back. I was 15 when Beverly died. It was spring, but the air felt like February, cold, sharp, and full of things left unsaid. The dogwood trees around the church had just begun to bloom, but their blossoms looked fragile, as if a strong wind could strip them bare in an instant. I remember the way the sky hung low over the cemetery, gray and heavy like it was grieving too. That morning I put on a black dress that didn't fit quite right and brushed my hair back so tightly it gave me a headache. I didn't cry while getting ready. I didn't cry in the car. Not even when we arrived at the church and I saw the coffin, closed and draped in white lilies. It was only when I saw Harold's hands, old, trembling, empty of hers, that something cracked inside me. And even then the tears came slow and silent, not in sobs but in a quiet ache that sat in the back of my throat. The service was simple. Beverly wouldn't have wanted anything elaborate. She hated fuss. A few hymns, a few kind words from neighbors and friends. The pastor talked about her strength, her loyalty, her capacity for love. Every word felt true and insufficient all at once. I sat in the front pew next to Harold, holding his hand in both of mine. His grip was firm, but I could feel the fatigue in his bones, the weight he now carried alone. That was the first time I realized that loss didn't just take a person. It took the rhythm of your days, the color of your mornings, the sound of someone calling your name when no one else did. And then they came. Carolyn and Jack slipped into the church after the service had already begun. I heard the doors open behind me, slow and careless, as if it were just another event on their calendar. I didn't turn around at first. I didn't need to. I felt their presence like static in the room, uninvited, indifferent, somehow colder than the air outside. They sat in the very back row, not with the family, not with the people who had known Beverly, but like observers in a courtroom, detached and watching. I didn't understand why they came. Guilt? Curiosity? Obligation? It certainly wasn't grief. Carolyn looked polished as ever, lipstick flawless, not a single strand of hair out of place. Jack was thinner than I remembered, older too, but the look on his face was blank, distant. Neither of them cried. Neither of them approached the casket. They stood stiffly during the hymns, sat quickly when it was over, and said nothing as Harold and I made our way out of the church. At the gravesite I stayed close to Harold. The casket lowered slowly into the ground, and with it, I felt the last piece of childhood sink beneath the soil. After the prayers ended and people began to drift away, murmuring their condolences, Harold and I remained. We stood in silence for a long time. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My chest felt hollow, like all the air had been stolen by the earth that now held her. Eventually Harold looked at me. His eyes were red but clear, his voice steady even though it carried the weight of decades. Real love, he said, barely louder than the wind, isn't a feeling. It's a daily choice. It's what you do, not what you say. Those words landed somewhere deep in me, in a place I hadn't even known was open. I looked down at the grave, at the fresh dirt piled beside it, at the flowers slowly wilting under the gray sky, and I understood. Beverly hadn't stayed because she had to. She stayed because she chose to. Every day. Every scraped knee, every school play, every sleepless night. She didn't owe me anything. But she gave me everything. That's what love was. I looked over my shoulder then and saw Carolyn and Jack standing at a distance. They weren't talking to anyone. They hadn't approached Harold, hadn't said a word to me. Carolyn was checking her watch. Jack's hands were in his pockets. They looked like they were waiting for a cab, not mourning a woman who had once saved their daughter from abandonment. And still some part of me, small, stubborn, pathetic, hoped they would come closer. That they would say something, anything that might crack the shell they'd wrapped themselves in. Maybe an apology. Maybe a question. Maybe just a look that said they understood what they'd missed. But they didn't. And so I turned away from them and walked with Harold back to the car. That night the house felt impossibly quiet. Her slippers were still by the door. Her mug still sat on the kitchen counter, the one she always used for peppermint tea. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall, and for the first time in years, I let myself wonder what might have been different if they hadn't left. Would Beverly have lived an easier life? Would Harold have laughed more? Would I have known something softer, less burdened by the shape of what was missing? I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the creaks in the hallway, half expecting her footsteps even though I knew they'd never come again. My mind kept circling back to Harold's words, anchoring me against the weight of everything I'd lost. A daily choice. That's what love was. Not showing up only when it was too late. Not claiming grief without having given anything. Not standing in the back row of a life and pretending you belonged there. That day marked something permanent in me. It sealed what I already knew but hadn't dared say aloud. Blood wasn't the same as family. Family was presence. Family was sacrifice. Family was sitting beside someone through every moment, beautiful or unbearable, and choosing to stay. And yet, even with that certainty, something inside me refused to extinguish completely. Some flicker of hope, irrational and cruel, lingered in my chest. Maybe it was the child I used to be, still holding those old drawings by the window, still watching the road. Maybe it was the part of me that had to believe people could change even if they hadn't yet. Even if they never would. But hope is not the same as trust. And that was the day I stopped mistaking one for the other. I found the first journal the day after Harold's funeral, when the silence in the house had become too loud to ignore and I needed something, anything, to keep my hands busy. The air in his study was still thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, the kind he hadn't touched in years but which lingered in the walls, in the fabric of his old armchair, in the folds of the heavy curtains he refused to replace. The room had always felt untouchable, sacred, a space built from dark wood, discipline, and memory. I stood for a long moment just inside the doorway, unsure whether I was violating something by stepping inside. The desk was exactly as he'd left it, neat, methodical, with the same mechanical pencil aligned parallel to the edge, the blotting paper still clean, and the leather desk pad slightly worn where his elbow had rested. I opened the top drawer out of instinct, not really expecting to find anything more than spare paper clips or receipts from the hardware store. But underneath a thin layer of bills and correspondence, there was a stack of leather-bound notebooks, uniform in size and color, bound tightly with twine. They were labeled simply, Finances. The first one I opened began with a line written in Harold's steady, deliberate hand. March 2024. Carolyn called again. Requested $2,000 for Jack's latest venture. A marina investment this time. Promised repayment. Again. My stomach turned, slow at first, like the first twist of a storm cloud before the sky cracks open. I flipped to the next entry. April 2024. Another $2,000. Said it was urgent. Jack is behind on loan payments. Beverly would not have approved of this. And again. May 2024. June. July. Every month. Like clockwork. I kept reading, my hands beginning to tremble as the pattern unfolded in brutal, nauseating repetition. Always Carolyn's name. Always Jack's business. Always a request, never a return. And the dates stretched back, through 2023, 2022, 2021. The deeper I dug, the older the paper became, the shakier Harold's handwriting grew, but the message never changed. 25 years. The final entry in the earliest journal was dated April 1999, not long after I turned 9. Carolyn asked again. Said it was just temporary. Jack has a friend opening a car dealership in Nevada. Assured me they're doing well. Asked me not to tell Sarah. I stopped reading after that. I couldn't breathe. I pulled every journal out of the drawer and stacked them in chronological order on the desk. There were 27 volumes in total. Each one filled front to back with columns of numbers, calculations, notes, occasional comments scribbled in the margins. Some were straightforward. $2000 wired to Carolyn. Said Jack needs capital for crypto mining. Others were dripping with exhaustion. She says it's the last time. I don't believe her. But I can't bear to hang up on my own daughter. I did the math 3 times. Cross-referenced with the amounts. Confirmed the dates. $2,000 a month, every month for 25 years. $600,000. And that was the conservative estimate. Not counting the occasional extra requests for emergencies, or the holiday bonuses Carolyn seemed to guilt him into each December. All that money. While Harold was cutting back on groceries, refusing to repair the leaking roof because it wasn't worth the trouble, canceling subscriptions, selling off old books he used to love, saying over and over, "I'm just simplifying." All those years I believed him. I thought he was just aging, getting practical. I didn't know he was bleeding money into a black hole disguised as a daughter and her absent husband. A daughter who couldn't bother to visit when his breathing grew shallow, when the weight of age settled into his bones so heavily that he stopped reading the paper, stopped cooking, stopped answering calls from anyone but me. They didn't come when Beverly died. They didn't come when Harold had his first stroke. They didn't come when the doctors said he didn't have much time left. But the requests kept coming. It was all there: casino transfers, wire receipts, vague investment names that led to nothing but failed LLCs and abandoned P.O. boxes. They used him. They drained him. They smiled through phone calls and promised paybacks and love and when things get better, while sending him deeper into debt and older into exhaustion. And he kept giving. Because I realized he had never stopped hoping. Just like I hadn't. The betrayal didn't come from what they took. It came from the fact that he never told me. That he protected them. That even in his last years, when his body was falling apart and the fire in him was reduced to embers, he still chose to believe that maybe this time would be different. I stared at those notebooks for what felt like hours. A part of me wanted to burn them. Another part wanted to send copies to every person who had ever met Carolyn and Jack. But mostly I felt numb. A hollow, ringing silence settled inside my chest. I had spent so many years building walls around the space they left behind, thinking that pain had turned to scar tissue. But this was new. This was raw. Because even after everything, after the abandonment, after the years of silence, they still had access. Not to my heart, not anymore, but to the man who raised me. They found their way in through his love and exploited it, carved pieces out of him until there was nothing left but obligation and fatigue. They took his money, his energy, his peace of mind. And now in court they wanted more. But they wouldn't get it. Not this time. The computer sat in the corner of Harold's study like an artifact from another life. Dusty, slow to boot, its monitor still framed by old sticky notes he'd never removed. It took nearly 5 minutes for it to come alive, blinking with the familiar startup time that now felt strangely ominous. I hadn't touched it since he passed. Something about it had felt too intimate, too close to the part of him I was still grieving. But after the journals, after the discovery of 25 years of bleeding finances, I knew I had to go deeper. I had to see what he hadn't told me. Not because I doubted him, no, not for a second, but because the time for silence was over. I needed proof. When the desktop finally loaded, I opened his email. His password was the same one he used for everything: my birthday. I typed it in slowly, hesitating only once, as if unlocking this account might somehow collapse what little distance I had left between grief and fury. The inbox was full. Over 3,000 unread messages, most of them newsletters or updates from his favorite news sites, but I didn't need to sift far before I found them. Subject lines like breadcrumbs scattered across years. "Dad, please help us. Just this one time. It's serious, Jack is in trouble. We miss you, please call. Sarah doesn't need to know." Each one carried the same weightless desperation. I opened one dated July 12, 2022. "Dear Daddy," it began, "I hate asking, you know I do, but we're in a real bind. Jack's business partner vanished and left us with the debt. It's only $2,000. We're not asking for a gift, just a loan. Please don't tell Sarah. He worries too much. We're thinking of coming to visit soon. Love you so much." Visit. They never did. The next one was worse. February 2021. "We're at the hospital almost every day with Jack's heart. You know how scary this is. We just need help covering a few bills. I promise this is the last time." She attached a photo of Jack in what looked like a waiting room, head down, hoodie up, a magazine in his lap. But something about the lighting was off. I downloaded the photo, ran it through reverse image search. It had been taken 3 years earlier. Posted online in 2018 with a completely different caption: "Waiting for our flight to Miami." My hands went cold. I opened her social media next. I hadn't checked in years. After all, what was the point? We weren't connected, and I had long since stopped looking for signs of a relationship that wasn't there. But her profile was public. Too public. Dozens of photos carelessly posted. July 2022, she was at a resort in Cabo San Lucas, holding a cocktail in a cabana, captioned, Finally some peace. That same week she'd emailed Harold for money to cover emergency dental surgery. The timeline was damning. Week after week, month after month, emails begging for money followed by Instagram photos showing beachfront villas, spa treatments, brunches in New York, designer shopping bags slung over her shoulder. And always the same language in the messages: "We miss you so much. You're our only hope. You're the only one who's ever been there for us." Each lie pressed tighter against my ribs, one after another, until breathing felt like swallowing gravel. They weren't just using him. They were mocking him. They'd crafted an entire illusion of struggle, wearing it like a mask while living in indulgence. They'd fabricated emergencies and illnesses while sipping champagne and flashing new watches. And he believed them. Because he wanted to. Because he needed to. Because hope is a cruel, quiet companion that whispers comfort even as it corrodes you from the inside. I began collecting everything. I downloaded every email, saved every photo, took screenshots with timestamps. I cross-referenced bank statements from the journals with dates of Carolyn's requests, and matched them to public posts. November 2020, Jack just got out of the year. We're overwhelmed with bills. That same week, she posted a selfie from a shopping center in Dubai, tagged in a luxury boutique. I tracked IP addresses. The emails were sent from places nowhere near where she claimed to be. Hospitals she mentioned had no patient records for Jack under his full name. The loan companies she referenced didn't exist. One of them was a fake name she recycled 3 different times, each with a different story. I printed everything: emails, social media screenshots, property records showing that they'd rented yachts under aliases. I gathered receipts for spa visits, plane tickets, hotel bookings. I submitted formal requests for public records from the state and traced the flow of funds through wire transfers. I documented it all, line by line, moment by moment, because I knew this wasn't just about money. This was about betrayal. This was about a man who had spent his life believing he was helping, who went without comfort so they could bask in luxury, who died thinking maybe, just maybe, his daughter loved him. They had no idea who I'd become. And I didn't care if they believed I was doing it out of spite or vengeance. Because I knew the truth. I was doing it out of love. For Harold, for the quiet strength he had carried every day, for the sacrifices he never spoke of. I was going to lay every single lie bare. In a courtroom, under oath, in front of a judge and anyone else who would listen. Not to punish them, though they deserved it, but to honor him. To show the world exactly what they had done. And who they had done it to. I should have expected it. I should have known that the moment the evidence began to stack too high to ignore, they would do what they'd always done. Shift blame, distort truth, and crawl behind someone else's voice. This time that voice had a name: Harris Crane. Their attorney. A man known for his theatrical flair and lack of scruples. The kind who smiled on the courthouse steps while twisting a knife behind the scenes. He didn't waste time. The moment we filed the first motion challenging the legitimacy of their claims, the storm began. It started with the newspapers. The first headline appeared 3 days later on the front page of a regional daily I used to respect. Prosecutor accused of manipulating elderly grandfather to secure inheritance. Beneath it was a photo of me leaving the courthouse, my mouth mid-sentence, my face hardened by the flash of cameras. And next to it, strategically placed, a glossy photo of Carolyn, eyes red, lips trembling, a tissue clutched in one hand, standing beneath the blooming oak trees of a cemetery she'd only visited once. The article quoted close family sources, who claimed I had pressured Harold into changing the will, isolating him from his only daughter, and poisoning him against his blood. I read the piece twice. My hands were cold by the end. My name appeared 13 times, and nowhere in those paragraphs was there mention of the financial records, the 25 years of documented withdrawals, the lies they'd told, or the photos that laid bare the truth. They controlled the narrative now, at least publicly, and Harris Crane made sure it spread like wildfire. Television segments followed. Panel discussions. Social media commentary. My inbox filled with questions I had no time to answer and insults I had no desire to read. People I'd never met had opinions about the kind of granddaughter I was. About the kind of woman I must be. Accusations rolled in faster than I could track. Gold digger. Opportunist. Unfit prosecutor. But they didn't stop at the media. That was just the beginning. 2 anonymous letters were delivered to the office of the district attorney. One printed, one handwritten in messy block letters. Both alleged unethical behavior. They claimed I had used my position to intimidate witnesses, that I had manipulated court clerks into moving dates, that I'd accessed sealed documents without authorization. Lies, all of it. But enough to trigger a formal inquiry. I was summoned by Internal Affairs the next morning. I sat in a cold office under fluorescent lights, answering questions about my personal case, forced to recuse myself from 2 active trials while they reviewed my record. Colleagues who once smiled at me in the hallway now kept their distance, unsure what to believe, unwilling to stand too close to the flames. They went further still. Private investigators were hired, shadowing my movements, photographing my house, calling my neighbors, asking questions about my character. One of them knocked on the door of my childhood friend, pretending to be a journalist. They tried to find something, anything, to tarnish my name. Every choice I'd made, every case I'd tried, every friendship I'd maintained, suddenly, it all felt like evidence waiting to be twisted. But the worst part was not the lies in print or the poison whispers behind closed doors. It was the sense of being hunted. Of knowing that truth alone might not be enough. That I was not simply defending a will anymore. I was defending the life Harold and Beverly gave me. Defending my name. My work. My memory of them. And it was no longer a matter of inheritance. It was a siege. Crane gave interviews with his signature smirk, always careful to frame it as concern. "We're just asking the questions everyone's afraid to," he said on morning television. "If a prosecutor has the power to isolate an elderly man and change his estate in her favor, shouldn't that concern us all?" He made it sound reasonable. Measured. And people listened. Carolyn wept on cue in her interviews. "I just wanted to rebuild our relationship," she said to one reporter, her voice breaking. But she never let us near him. She kept him to herself. And now he's gone and we have nothing left. They forgot to mention the yachts. The casinos. The shopping sprees. The empty promises. The voicemail she left Harold 2 years ago. "If you won't help us, don't expect a call when you're dead." I had that recording. I hadn't used it, yet. But every word was etched into my spine. I didn't respond to the media. I didn't go on TV or issue statements. I stayed silent in public because I knew that the real fight wasn't happening on screens. It was happening in court. In documents. In evidence. I poured myself into building the case, meticulously cross-referencing timelines, cataloging payments, matching Instagram timestamps to fabricated emergencies, organizing emails, notarized affidavits and tax records. Every moment Harold gave, every dollar he sacrificed, every lie they told, I built it into a wall they wouldn't climb. But I felt it. This wasn't justice. This was war. And in war, truth is never enough on its own. It has to be wielded, sharpened, made undeniable. I didn't cry. I didn't hide. I stood in the ruins of their fiction, gathering the ashes of their narrative and shaping them into fact. They had underestimated me. Thought their power, their name, their show of grief would be enough to bury everything I'd built. But I was no longer the girl on the porch waiting for parents who never came. I was the woman they had tried to silence. And I knew exactly what silence cost. It was late, well past midnight when I found the safe. I hadn't been sleeping, not really, only drifting in and out of exhausted spirals of thought, chasing court filings in my mind, mentally rehearsing every defense I'd need to deliver, every attack I'd need to counter. The house, dim and quiet, felt different now. Not haunted exactly, but protective in its silence, like it knew what I was searching for before I did. I was in the study again, scanning the bookshelves for an old law volume Harold had often quoted. Something had pulled me there, some part of me that knew there was more. I ran my fingers along the spines, row by row, until one book didn't move the way the others did. It was slightly heavier, not in weight but in resistance. I pulled it gently forward, and as it tilted, I heard a faint click behind the shelf. The panel shifted just enough to reveal a small embedded safe, steel gray, scratched, with a manual dial. I stared at it for a long moment. The combination came to me faster than it should have. Beverly's birthday. It had always been the number Harold returned to for everything important. I turned the dial carefully, breath held tight in my throat, until I felt the final notch fall into place with a soft metallic thunk. Inside was a single envelope. The paper was thick, sealed in the kind of formal way lawyers use when sending final directives. My name was written across the front in Harold's handwriting, precise, unmistakable. My hands shook slightly as I broke the seal. "If you're reading this," it began, "then they've already started their assault." I sat down slowly in his old leather chair, holding the letter with both hands, reading each line as though his voice were speaking through the quiet around me. I didn't want it to come to this. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Carolyn would finally act with dignity. That Jack would find his spine. But if you've opened this, then I know they've done what they always do. Take what isn't theirs and burn what they cannot own. The words hit me like cold water, like a sudden gust in a room with closed windows. I kept reading. "I chose you, Sarah, not out of sentiment but out of judgment. I have watched you grow into someone who does not bend under pressure, who speaks when it would be easier to stay silent. You earned my trust not because of blood but because of who you are. I kept this letter hidden because I knew the kind of people you were up against. and I knew they would try to twist everything. I turned the page. My eyes caught on the next line and held there. In this envelope is a notarized letter, written and signed by me, dated April 5, 2024, explaining my mental state and my decision to update my will. It was written without influence, in full soundness of mind, and in the presence of legal counsel. I made these choices not under pressure but from clarity. I leave this as protection, for you and for the truth. I felt the heat rise in my chest as I reached into the envelope again and pulled out the second document. It was exactly what he said it was. A signed, notarized letter written in Harold's careful penmanship, with the notary's stamp and seal. Dated witnessed. Ironclad. It began simply. To whom it may concern. This letter is to affirm that my most recent estate decisions, including the full designation of my granddaughter Sarah Blake as primary beneficiary and executor, were made of my own free will and sound mind. I have not been coerced, manipulated, or misled. Sarah has been my caregiver, my companion, and my closest family for decades. She has earned my trust, my respect, and my gratitude. My daughter Carolyn and her husband Jack have been absent from my life by choice, not circumstance. Their recent contact has been inconsistent, often tied to financial requests. I have kept detailed records of these interactions. Should they attempt to contest these decisions, let this letter serve as my clear and personal testimony. Harold. My throat tightened. For a long time I couldn't move. My eyes traced his signature over and over, almost afraid it would disappear the longer I looked at it. I'd spent weeks gathering data, building arguments, collecting timelines, establishing motive. But this was the voice that cut through everything. Not mine. His. And no court could ignore it. This was the breakthrough I needed. The one piece they couldn't explain away or smear with headlines and television tears. It came from the man at the center of it all, calm, unwavering, and conscious to the very end. He had seen them clearly. He had seen me clearly. And he had planned for this. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of the war we were in settling differently now. For the first time in weeks I didn't feel alone. I felt aligned with something greater than anger or grief. I felt fortified. Because Harold had not just left me the burden of his defense. He had left me his voice, preserved in ink and will. And now I would carry it into the light. The lies had spread quickly, but the truth had roots, deep, old, and stronger than I realized. I hadn't expected anyone to stand with me. Not after the headlines. Not after the media storm that painted me as a manipulator in pearls, a calculating granddaughter who'd built a life on deception. But Harold had not lived in isolation. He had been a judge, a mentor, a friend. And he had left behind more than paper trails and ledgers. He had left people. And they remembered. It started quietly. A message left at my office from a woman named Helen Myers, someone I hadn't heard from in years. She had worked with Harold during his last few years on the bench. She said simply, "I have something you should see." He didn't want it forgotten. When I met her that evening in a quiet corner booth of a diner that still smelled like 1964, she handed me a letter. It was folded, handled with care, the ink slightly smudged near the corners. It was a character statement Harold had written for her son years ago, long after he'd retired, when the boy had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had no obligation to help. But he did. The letter spoke of redemption, of potential, of fairness in the face of complexity. Helen said it saved her son's future. Her voice trembled when she added, "He said Sarah was the same kind of fighter." I never forgot that. The next day 2 more people came forward. A former clerk, then a retired bailiff. Both had stories. Both had saved voicemails, emails, old handwritten notes Harold had sent. Not because he asked them to, but because he was the kind of man you didn't forget. They wanted to testify. They wanted to speak. One said, "If they're attacking you, they're attacking him too. And I won't stand for it." But the most important piece came from Tommy Winston. Tommy had been Harold's friend since law school, and though they'd taken different paths, Harold to the bench, Tommy to community legal services, they had remained close through decades. He was a quiet man, thin, with knotted hands and a gaze that seemed to measure everything in truth before he ever spoke. I hadn't seen him since Harold's funeral, and when he appeared at my door, I didn't expect anything more than condolences. But he was holding something in his hands, a worn leather-bound notebook with pages fraying at the edges. "He didn't keep this one in the study," Tommy said, his voice low. "Said it was for his own heart, not the court. I think he meant for you to have it." I took the notebook with careful hands and sat down to read it that night, beneath the same lamp Harold used to keep on when he read the newspaper after dinner. The journal was different from the ones in the desk. More intimate, more raw. It began a year after Beverly passed, when the loneliness had started to settle into Harold's bones and the phone calls from Carolyn began to increase in frequency and demand. August 2020, Carolyn called today. Wanted money again. Didn't ask how I'm doing. Didn't ask if I've eaten. Said Jack has a new project. I sent it anyway. I don't know why. December 2021. It was Christmas. Sarah came over. He made dinner. We watched the old movies Beverly loved. Carolyn didn't call, but she sent a message the next day, wanted help with a property tax issue. She didn't ask how my holiday was. March 2023. I'm getting tired. Not just old, tired. The kind of tired that makes a man feel like a ghost. Sarah's the only one who notices. She brought me tea last night and didn't say anything when I couldn't hold the cup steady. Carolyn sent a photo from Hawaii. She asked for $3,000. Said it was urgent. I sent it. Then sat alone for hours. I should stop. And then dated just a few months before his death. I think she knows I'm not well. But she still asks. There's no shame in her voice. No pause. Just need after need after need. Sarah has never asked me for anything. She gives me peace. That's more than they ever have. Each page felt like a wound he'd kept quiet. Each line, a whispered confession I hadn't known he carried. And in every word, a clear picture formed, not just of Harold's state of mind but of his clarity, his quiet awareness and his heartbreak. These were not the ramblings of a confused old man. They were the records of someone deeply conscious of what was happening to him. He hadn't been blind. He had simply hoped. Until hope began to exhaust him. I scanned the journal in full and added it to the growing archive of evidence. Each document was a stone. Each testimony a brick. And together they were becoming a wall too high for lies to climb. The narrative that Crane had built, of a clever granddaughter manipulating a fragile man, was beginning to crack. Not just in the courtroom but in the public eye. Because now people were speaking. Letters of support began arriving at the courthouse. Former colleagues. Students Harold had mentored. A janitor from the courthouse who remembered how Harold brought him soup during an illness, and how Carolyn had once screamed at him for blocking her car when she stopped by unannounced to ask for money. Everyone had a piece of the truth. And together, those pieces were forming a picture that could no longer be ignored. Every testimony, every letter, every message chipped away at the image my parents had tried to build in the press. They were running out of places to hide. And I was no longer standing alone. I had Harold's words. I had his friends. And I had the truth. And that was more powerful than anything they'd ever built on a lie. The courtroom was colder than usual, or maybe it was just me. My palms frozen around the edge of the defense table, my pulse steady but heavy, like a drumbeat buried deep under my skin. Day 1. After months of preparation, of silence, of standing against a tidal wave of accusations and public scrutiny, the moment had arrived. The judge entered, the room rose, and everything narrowed to breath, movement, timing. I stood, spine straight, my voice clear. I had waited my entire life to be heard, not as someone's daughter, not as a prosecutor, not as a target, but as the one who remembered everything. I began with the numbers. Cold, factual, unforgiving. Your Honor, I said, handing over the thick stack of financial records. These are payment logs and bank statements, totaling over $600,000, transferred from my grandfather to Carolyn Blake and Jack Thomas over a span of 25 years. These payments were often made under the pretense of emergencies, most of which we now know to be fabricated. I watched the judge's eyes move over the pages, his expression unchanging, but his fingers gripped the documents a little tighter. Across the courtroom, Carolyn sat with her chin slightly raised, but I saw it. The way her lips pressed together too hard, how her right hand fiddled with the clasp of her purse. Jack was silent beside her, his eyes darting, his foot tapping. Anne Crane, their attorney, adjusted his tie too often. I continued, now submitting the journals. These are personal logs written by Harold Blake, documenting every request made by the plaintiffs. They span 2 decades. His handwriting is consistent. His language is clear. There are no signs of confusion or diminished capacity. I paused for a breath. But there is a pattern, a painful one. Then came the emails. Dozens of them. Pleas for money, manipulative language, guilt-wrapped demands followed by vacation photos, spa appointments, purchases of luxury goods. And finally I played the video. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered. It was Harold sitting in the study, back straight, his voice unmistakably steady. He looked straight into the camera. If this is ever shown in court, he said, then I assume my daughter is challenging the will. Let me be clear. I have not been manipulated. I have not been coerced. My mind is my own. I have chosen Sarah to inherit my estate because she is the one who has stood by me. Because she never asked for anything. Because she has earned not just my trust but my pride. My daughter has contacted me consistently only for money. I loved her once. But love without effort dies. I have no regrets. The room was silent. The judge didn't speak immediately. He sat back, removed his glasses and looked between the video screen and the documents on the desk in front of him. Then slowly, deliberately he turned to the plaintiff's side and said, "Based on the clarity of evidence, I find no grounds to question Mr. Blake's mental capacity or the validity of his last will and testament. The motion to challenge the will is denied." A sharp breath escaped my lungs. Not a gasp, not a sob. Just a single silent exhale that felt like releasing the weight I had been carrying for years. My fists unclenched. I looked across the courtroom. And that was when I saw it. For the first time, Carolyn's face had changed. The perfectly rehearsed composure, the subtle arrogance that carried her through press interviews and public appearances, had cracked. Her eyes were too wide. Her posture too stiff. Her mouth, no longer curled in a soft, practiced sorrow, had drawn into a tight, thin line. She wasn't confident anymore. She was afraid. Jack leaned toward her, whispering something, but she didn't respond. Her hands gripped the bench in front of her. Harris Crane sat motionless, no longer smug, his face neutral but tight around the jaw. They hadn't expected to lose so quickly, so definitively. They had underestimated the depth of Harold's foresight, and the strength of the evidence he left behind. The gavel fell. The judge adjourned for the day. And as I stepped out of the courtroom, the hallway exploded. Reporters flooded the corridor, microphones extended like drawn weapons, flashes firing in every direction. "Sarah, do you have a comment? Ms. Blake, was this about money or justice? Can you respond to the allegations?" I pushed through them silently, my attorney shielding me with one arm. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what they would see behind me. Carolyn, still in the courtroom, finally unsure of herself. No cameras now. No spotlight. Just fear. Because her story was crumbling, and the truth was louder than the lie she had spent a lifetime building. And this was only the first day. The second day began colder than the first, not in temperature but in tone. There was something brittle in the air as we walked into the courtroom, like glass just before it shatters. I could feel it. A shift. Crane had lost the first battle, and now he was coming not for my case but for me. He didn't waste time. No introductions, no warm-up, just a direct motion submitted to the bench. A formal request for court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. His voice was sharp, confident, almost bored, as though what he was suggesting was procedural, even routine. "We submit that Ms. Sarah Blake, while professionally capable, is currently acting from a place of emotional instability," Crane announced. The intense grief of losing her grandfather, combined with the burden of managing an estate of this size, raises questions about her capacity to make rational decisions in an ongoing legal matter. Furthermore, her actions suggest obsessive behavior and an inability to separate personal vendetta from fiduciary duty. Every word was a deliberate needle. I sat still, my hands clasped tightly together, my gaze fixed on the judge, not on Crane. I had prepared for attacks. I had braced for smears and fabrications. But still, hearing him stand there and casually question my sanity in open court felt like being flayed in slow motion. He was trying to unravel me, not just in the eyes of the court but in front of the public, the press, the very foundation I had built my life on. He continued, "We request an independent psychiatric evaluation to determine if Ms. Blake is fit to act as executor and primary beneficiary, and whether undue influence can be attributed not to her actions, but to her fragile state of mind at the time of Mr. Blake's death." I wanted to speak then, to say something, anything, but I didn't. I stayed silent. Because this wasn't the time to defend myself. Not yet. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unmoved. "Do you have grounds?" he asked coolly. Crane gestured toward a prepared file. "Her behavior in court has been emotionally charged. Her attachment to the decedent is admittedly deep, and she has presented herself as both litigator and witness, which complicates her objectivity. We're concerned about her ability to manage significant assets without emotional bias." Then my attorney stood, calm and steady. "Your Honor, we anticipated such tactics. They are not based on medical evidence but strategic humiliation. And we are prepared to demonstrate not only Ms. Blake's fitness, but the clear mental competency of the deceased at the time the will was finalized." The judge nodded. "Very well. Let's hear the witness." And then, as if summoned by the weight of justice itself, Harold's doctor stepped forward. Dr. Amelia Roth, a neurologist and geriatric specialist, had treated Harold for nearly a decade. She took the stand with quiet confidence, her voice clear and without the affectation or performance that Crane had relied on all morning. "I evaluated Mr. Harold Blake semi-annually beginning in 2015, she began. "In each assessment he demonstrated excellent cognitive stability. His memory recall, executive reasoning, language processing, and decision-making remained within or above the expected range for his age. Crane shifted uncomfortably. I submitted full reports to his primary care physician and maintained a copy with my own practice. As recently as April 2024, just a few months before his passing, Mr. Blake scored in the 93rd percentile on his MMSE cognitive function exam. His writing was lucid, his planning was detailed, and his sense of time and context was impeccable. Would you say, my attorney asked, that he was capable of making informed, independent decisions regarding his estate? Without hesitation, she said. There was no indication of dementia, no sign of cognitive deterioration, no history of psychiatric illness, no dependence on anyone for mental processing or memory recall. In fact, he often joked that his mind was sharper than the country he once served in the courtroom. There was a pause. Then from the gallery someone chuckled. And then applause. Not loud. Not disruptive. But steady, people rising to their feet in quiet solidarity. I turned slightly and saw them. Harold's friends, former colleagues, old clients, neighbors, some of whom had stood beside me through the media storm, and others who had come silently, waiting for the truth to speak louder than accusation. Their clapping wasn't for me. It was for him. For the man they remembered. The man who had always known what he was doing. The judge let the moment breathe, then rapped his gavel once. This court finds no basis for psychiatric evaluation of the defendant. The motion is denied. Crane didn't speak. He just sat down slowly, jaw locked, papers untouched. I exhaled. For the first time since this began, the courtroom didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place where the truth was beginning to find its footing again, where my voice wasn't just heard but believed. The wall they'd tried to build around me with gossip, suspicion, and accusation was starting to collapse under the weight of facts, testimony, and Harold's own unwavering clarity. They had tried to break me with shame. But all they had done was give me the chance to show, beyond all doubt, that I wasn't the one who had anything to hide. And I wasn't alone. I had waited for this moment with a kind of quiet dread, the type that grows deeper the closer you get to it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the awareness that this would be the end of something. The final stone laid. The last breath of the lie my parents had wrapped themselves in. And I wasn't sure what would come after. Only that it was necessary. When the judge called the next witness, the courtroom hushed. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. The door opened and he stepped in. Michael Evans, senior manager at Central Texas Credit Union, Harold's private banker for over 15 years. He was calm, clean-cut, and carried himself with the kind of presence that didn't need spectacle. I had reached out to him myself weeks earlier, after noticing a discrepancy in one of Harold's final bank statements. What he told me in our first quiet meeting had chilled me. What he was about to say in open court would make it impossible for anyone to pretend any longer. He was sworn in. My attorney asked the first question. Mr. Evans, can you confirm your professional relationship with the late Mr. Harold Blake? Yes, Michael replied. I personally managed Mr. Blake's primary accounts and investments for the last 15 years. I met with him regularly both in branch and in his later years at his home. And during that time, did you ever have interactions with his daughter, Carolyn Blake? His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. On 3 separate occasions. My fingers curled slowly around the edge of the table. Please describe those occasions. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. The first was in April of 2016. Miss Carolyn Blake came into the branch claiming she had her father's permission to withdraw funds. She did not have legal access to the account and could not produce a power of attorney. She became aggressive when denied. Security was nearly called. The audience murmured. The second was in August 2019. She attempted a wire transfer using what she described as a pre-signed withdrawal form. It was forged. We flagged it immediately. Mr. Blake later confirmed in person that he had not signed the document. The judge leaned forward slightly. Carolyn's face had gone still, stone pale, mouth open but frozen in place. And the third? My attorney asked. Michael didn't flinch. The third was 4 days before Mr. Blake's death. Ms. Blake appeared at the branch again, this time stating her father was too ill to come in but needed her to access the funds for end-of-life arrangements. Again, she had no power of attorney, no court order, and no written instruction from Mr. Blake. She grew angry when refused and left without further action. I documented all 3 incidents in compliance reports, which were filed immediately and are available in this folder. He passed the documents to the bailiff. The silence in the room thickened. It wasn't just tension now. It was collective disbelief. Would you say, the judge asked directly, that these attempts were unauthorized? Absolutely. Mr. Blake never once added Carolyn Blake to his accounts, never issued any joint authority, and made it clear in our meetings that she was not to be given access. There was no more room for interpretation. No more stories to twist. No emotional performance to hide behind. It was written, documented, sealed. She had tried to take the money. Not decades ago, not in youthful confusion, but days before Harold died. When he was fragile. When she must have known there was no time left. And still, she reached for what wasn't hers. I didn't turn to look at her. I didn't need to. The stillness said enough. The audience broke into a quiet wave of gasps and murmurs. I saw reporters writing furiously. Phones lit up. Eyes shifted. The narrative, so carefully constructed by Crane, by Carolyn's rehearsed sadness, by the media they manipulated, fractured in real time. No one clapped. No one smiled. It wasn't a victory anyone could celebrate. It was too devastating. Too human. It was the moment the truth came crashing down, and it left no one standing on her side. The judge spoke slowly, decisively. This court finds no grounds to contest the validity of the will, and no credible evidence of undue influence on the part of Ms. Sarah Blake. On the contrary, the evidence presented shows a consistent, documented pattern of financial misconduct attempted by the plaintiffs. The estate will remain in the possession of its rightful beneficiary, per the wishes of the deceased. It was over. I didn't exhale right away. I just sat there, motionless, the words settling around me like dust after demolition. I had dreamed of this moment, relief, maybe even triumph. But all I felt was quiet. Deep, immense quiet. The kind that follows after something you've been carrying finally slips from your shoulders, and your body doesn't know what to do with the weightlessness. Outside the courtroom, the press waited. I didn't stop for them. I didn't need their questions or their sound bites. The answer had already been given. The last lie had broken under the weight of the truth. And Carolyn, who once arrived with diamonds on her wrist and tears ready for the camera, walked out with nothing but silence behind her. I was in my office, late again, the same case files open across the desk, the light from the window already beginning to fade into the low orange-gray of evening. The courthouse felt quieter than usual, almost suspended, as if even the walls were waiting for what came next. I had just started reviewing final filings for the next morning when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps, uncertain, hesitant. I didn't expect anyone. When the door opened, I didn't stand. Carolyn stepped inside, careful, like someone entering a room they weren't sure they were welcome in. She was dressed differently now, no designer coat, no earrings flashing under courthouse lights, no dramatic scarf draped for effect. Just a simple blouse, sleeves rolled, makeup light, as if stripping away the performance might make her seem more real. But I had already learned that costumes aren't only worn for cameras. In her hands were photographs. She said nothing at first. Just walked slowly to the edge of my desk and set them down without a word. I looked at them without touching them. Faded edges, old corners, familiar colors. Me as a baby in her arms. Me asleep on her shoulder in some grainy living room. Me on a swing set, half blurred, her hands just behind me. I didn't need to be told where or when they were taken. I recognized the silence behind every smile. She sat across from me, a tissue already in her hand, tears already gathered. Her voice was soft, not shaking but calculated in its smallness. I know things went too far, she said. I know you're angry. She looked down at the photographs, then up at me. But we're still family, Sarah. That doesn't change. Not really. I said nothing. She waited as if expecting me to soften, to offer her something. I didn't. Her hand moved gently over one of the photos. I've been thinking, she continued, we don't have to keep dragging this through court. I've talked to Jack. We'd like to propose a settlement. 50-50. Cling. No more press. No more pain. She said pain like she'd ever held it. I looked at her then. Really looked. Her face was older now, thinner around the mouth, the lines near her eyes more visible without the distraction of performance. But beneath the soft voice and staged regret, I still saw the same woman who had walked into a courtroom and tried to erase a lifetime. The same woman who left me on a doorstep and called it temporary. The same woman who had tried to take from Harold in his final days and didn't even ask if he was breathing the week he died. And now, after everything, after the fake tears, the forged requests, the anonymous letters, the accusations, she was here. Not to apologize. Not to own what she had done. But to negotiate. I'm not angry, I said finally. My voice was level, quiet, even. Not anymore. She tilted her head slightly as if uncertain of the direction this would take. I'm not angry, I repeated. Because that would mean I still expected something from you. I don't. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tissue. The silence between us thickened. I'm not that child anymore, I said. The one who waited for you to call. The one who watched the driveway. The one who kept pretending your voice might still come back to life in the next room. I buried her. The same day I buried Harold. For a moment she didn't speak. Her next words were quiet. I know I've made mistakes. I didn't flinch. No. You made choices. And you made them again. And again. You showed me who you were every time you didn't show up. Every time you asked for money instead of asking how he felt. Every time you told the world I was a liar while he left behind the truth in writing. She blinked quickly. The tears were real now, but I had stopped feeling anything for them. The judge will hear final arguments tomorrow, I said, reaching calmly for the folder beside me. Court's at 9. Her lips parted slightly, a last attempt maybe. A last breath of something she thought she could still recover. But there was nothing left between us. No thread to pull. No window left open. Only ash where a bridge used to be. I didn't say goodbye. She stood slowly, gathered the photos, and walked out of my office without another word. The door closed behind her. And I turned back to my work. The final day in court felt like the slow passing of a storm. Heavy, inevitable, and waiting to release everything that had been building. The air inside the courtroom was still, tense in a way that made every sound seem louder, every breath sharper. The walls seemed to hold the weight of what we all knew was coming. This wasn't just the end of a case. This was the final reckoning of something much older, something that had been festering in silence for decades. The judge asked if we had any final evidence to submit, and I nodded once. We played the video. It was Harold once again. The same recording we had shown before, but this time, it was the full version. No edits. No breaks. Just his voice, his face, the way he blinked slowly and leaned forward in his chair like he was speaking across time. I've spent most of my life trying to believe that people can change, he said. Even those who leave, even those who take more than they ever give. I still love my daughter. I always will. But love and trust are not the same. Sarah has never made me choose between the two. She didn't just carry my name. She carried my legacy. She carried my dignity when I couldn't. She asked for nothing. Gave everything. She is not only my granddaughter by blood, she is my heir by soul. This isn't about money. It's about peace. And I want her to have it. No one moved. Not Crane. Not Carolyn. Not Jack. The words sat in the air like a final breath, a truth too complete to argue with. There was nothing left to dissect, no room for reinterpretation. The judge took a long moment before speaking. His voice was calm, clear, with no hesitation. This court finds no grounds to overturn or amend the last will and testament of Harold Blake. The evidence demonstrates a consistent, deliberate, and sound decision on the part of the decedent. The plaintiffs have failed to provide any credible proof of undue influence or diminished capacity. The estate will remain as designated. Furthermore, the plaintiffs will be responsible for covering all legal fees incurred during the course of these proceedings. He tapped the gavel once. The sound echoed through the room. And then silence. No clapping. No gasps. No camera flashes. Just stillness. I remained seated for a moment, the words sinking in not with triumph, but with a quiet finality. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't crying. I just felt still. Harold's voice still echoed in my ears, the way he had said peace. That was what I felt. Not joy. Not vindication. Just peace. I stood slowly, gathered the files from the table and turned toward the exit. That's when she came. Carolyn moved toward me with sudden speed, photographs still clutched in one hand, her eyes frantic. Not like someone with a plan, but like someone who had just realized there was no plan left. She reached for me, her voice breaking. Sarah, wait, please. You have to believe me, I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You're my daughter. You're still my daughter. Her hand touched my arm. I looked at her, really looked. Past the tears, past the ruined makeup and the desperate panic in her voice. I saw nothing of the woman I had hoped she would become. Only the one who had always been there beneath the surface. Performative, hollow, reaching for something only when it served her. My voice didn't shake. Margaret was my mother, I said quietly. You're just the woman who gave birth to me. She froze. The words didn't come from anger. They came from truth. Clean, cold, unmovable truth. Her hand dropped. I turned and walked away. Through the doors. Down the marble corridor. Past the reporters who didn't dare speak. Into the afternoon sun that waited beyond the courthouse steps. Behind me the last bridge burned. A year passed. A full cycle of seasons, anniversaries, hours that no longer bled from one courtroom into another but settled into something quieter, something steadier. The scars of the trial remained, but they had faded into the background of my life, like distant sirens outside a closed window, still audible but no longer urgent. The courtroom that once threatened to take everything from me had become my own. I was now a judge of the Travis County District Court. The day I stepped onto the bench, wearing the robe that felt both heavier and lighter than I expected, I carried Harold with me. Not just in memory but in the rhythm of my thinking, in the weight of each decision, in the quiet voice that always reminded me to pause before I ruled. The courtroom was mine, but it wasn't a throne. It was a place of work, of listening, of restraint. And I had no illusions about what justice meant. It wasn't always the verdict. It was in the process, in the care. Harold had taught me that with every decision he made in silence, with every word he chose not to speak, with every moment he spent choosing what was right over what was easy. I turned his old library into my chambers. The bookshelves were his, polished but left worn at the corners, still lined with titles that smelled like the past. His chair stood behind my desk, reupholstered but not replaced. I kept his fountain pen in the top drawer even though I never used it. The room looked like him, but it sounded like me. I added my own books, my own annotations. A copy of my first published decision, framed next to the photo of Beverly holding me at a school play. The light that came through the tall windows felt warmer here. I liked to believe he'd designed it that way when he built the shelves himself all those years ago. I started the Harold Blake Scholarship Fund on what would have been his 88th birthday. It was small at first. Just 2 students. But it grew quickly. It was open to kids raised by grandparents, guardians, older siblings. Anyone who understood that family wasn't always a straight line. I met with each of them personally. I told them about Harold. About how he made me memorize the Bill of Rights before I could ride my bike past the block. About how he made me debate the ethics of fairy tales before I could even spell justice. I told them about Beverly too, how she taught me that kindness had more power than any courtroom ruling. That a warm meal and someone who remembered your birthday could hold up a life better than any piece of legislation. Every week I returned to the cemetery. I planted roses by their graves, white for Beverly, deep red for Harold. They had always loved the garden, though they never had much time for it. Now it was mine to tend. I brought clippers, gloves, water, and patience. It was the one place I never brought my phone. I sat in the grass sometimes between the 2 headstones and read out loud. Old legal cases. New letters from students. Bits of poetry Harold once quoted but never attributed. I spoke to them not to mourn but to continue. Because none of it was about the money. Not the estate. Not the courtroom battle. It was always about what they gave me long before any inheritance. Conviction, integrity, steadiness, and above all, the refusal to turn away from the hard thing when the hard thing was right. I mentored young lawyers now. Some were nervous. Some were angry. Some wanted to win, others wanted to change the world. I told them what Harold told me on the day of Beverly's funeral, when the sky was gray and everything I loved felt like it was slipping away. I told them that justice was not always the verdict. It was not always clean. It did not always come with applause or certainty. Justice, I say to them every Friday afternoon before I leave chambers, is not just a courtroom decision. It's the daily fight for the truth. And you have to choose it every day. Especially when no one is watching. They listen. Some nod. Some roll their eyes. But I know which ones will carry it. I can see it in how they hold silence. That was Harold's test. Not how you spoke, but how you sat and what was unsaid. The woman who once sat at the defense table, stripped of family, questioned by the world, buried under grief and memory, no longer lived in fear. I still carried that version of myself, but now she was folded into something fuller. Something resolved. Because I had learned that legacy wasn't what you inherited. It was what you carried forward. And I was ready.